Good morning. Welcome to this next session of the Professional Week Speaker Series. I'm Mike Mills, Vice President of Elite, and we're excited today to have Professor Jasmine Roberts from The Ohio State University join us and talk about open education as a social justice tool. You may remember from yesterday's presentation by Brian Alexander that he talked about open education in a post-pandemic college, and we're excited to have Professor Roberts join us today. And with that, let me turn it over to my colleague, Shinta Hernandez, for a formal introduction. Shinta?
Morning, everyone. Thank you, Mike. Good morning, MC. I am Shinta Hernandez, Department Chair of Sociology, Anthropology, and Criminal Justice at the Rockville and Tacoma Park Silver Spring campuses. Thanks so much for being here. As Mike pointed out, we're going to continue a very powerful closing week with a real treat for you this morning. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Professor Jasmine Roberts. I actually met Professor Roberts when she and I were both keynote speakers at the Arizona Regional OER Conference this year. So it's so great to be with you again in this virtual Zoom space. Professor Roberts is a lecturer in the School of Communications at The Ohio State University, where she teaches in the areas of public relations writing, digital activism, and campaign strategy. Her advocacy work centers on the experiences of people of color, women, and queer communities. Along with her communication expertise, Professor Roberts is also a renowned open education leader. She's the author of the highly rated, openly licensed book, Writing for Strategic Communications Industries. In her spare time, she loves to connect with her green babies, all 52 plants, her fur babies, 2 dogs, and a loving fiance. They will get married next month. Professor Roberts holds a BA in Communication Studies in Spanish from the University of Michigan and an MA in Communications from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So I would like to tell everybody that if you have comments or questions, please put it in the chat. We will monitor that, and we will dedicate the last 10 to 15 minutes or so for a Q&A session. So without further ado, please give a warm Montgomery College welcome to Professor Jasmine Roberts.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Shinta, for that just warm introduction. I'm going to go ahead and say something that we're all familiar with, and I'll go ahead and share my screen. Let's see here. All right, can you all see those slides okay? Awesome. All right, I'm just getting everything situated. All right, so good morning. Like I said, I am Professor Jasmine Roberts. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm really excited to be here this morning to talk to you all about a little something called open education and how we can use open education as a social justice tool. And what I mean by that is basically trying to create a more socially just environment in academia. I'm also going to go into some specific examples of how we can do that through open education. I'm also going to touch on some examples that have nothing to do with open education, but can still help us to achieve a more socially just academe. And then also towards the end of my presentation, I'm going to talk about how, sometimes open isn't the best option, depending upon what we're trying to accomplish. So lots to kind of get through. I am going to speak for maybe the next 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. And I really want to hear you all's thoughts. I am not, however, that keynote or speaker that presents herself as all-knowing and I have all the answers. So what I'm really hoping at the end and when we have our Q&A is to have more of a discussion and really want to know what you all are thinking about and in terms of how these issues look like at your institution. So for the next, I would say 5 minutes or so, I do a lot of acknowledgements in my talk because since I am coming from a social justice framework, I think it's very important that you all kind of understand what that looks like for me as a scholar. So the first thing I want to go ahead and do is a territory acknowledgement. And so the territory acknowledgement that I'm currently doing is to acknowledge the traditional stewards of the land here where I live in, and that is Ohio. And so it's really my hope that these type of territory acknowledgements will help in our much needed path to reconcile our uncomfortable but real history. So again, these are the list of tribes or traditional stewards in the land Ohio. I find it very ironic that I live in Columbus, Ohio, which of course is named after a brutal colonizer, Christopher Columbus. and yet it is Indigenous territory. So another thing that I want to acknowledge is that throughout the talk, I'm going to use a lot of Black and Indigenous scholarship, but I also want to acknowledge that I'm not extremely knowledgeable in, how can I say this, like Indigenous education and some of the specific issues that Indigenous populations face in relation to higher education. I'm more well-versed in Black feminism and Black feminist scholarship, but I still think it's important to learn from Indigenous ways of knowing and elevate these examples and how they really are essential to the ways in which we understand some of our issues here. And then sometimes I feel like territory acknowledgements can, again, sometimes come across as a little performative. There's a lot that university can do or have to do in order to reckon with how they still do to this day benefit from the theft of Indigenous lands. It's not just universities, it's colleges as well. So this slide that I'm showing you is from a project called Land Grab University. Highly recommend that some of you all read that, not some, all of you read it. So journalist Tristan Awtown and I think a British historian by the name of Bobby Lee spent the last 2 years tracking how 11 million acres of land were actually taken from more than 250 Indigenous tribes or communities to help fund land grant universities in the mid to late 19th century. More specifically, the Morrill Act, of 1862 helped to create what we are calling this massive transfer of wealth from Indigenous communities to university endowments. So really what we have here is that, the financial success of universities and colleges was paid by the expropriation of Indigenous land and settler colonialism. So we can see how, for example, the University of Maryland benefited from this expropriation and theft of Indigenous land. So what I'm trying to do here is really stress the importance of connecting Indigenous lands to the foundation, specifically of public universities, beyond just a mere, territory acknowledgement. And then before I go into my next acknowledgement, I want to ask you all a question. And I feel like I know the answer to it, but I'm just going to ask it anyways. So how many of you all will be alive in the year 2111? So 2111. Not 2011, that's already passed. 2111. Anyone? Yeah, I don't think so. Unless we're going to invent something that will definitely expand our lifetime. Let me see what we have here in chat. Not likely, right? Nope. So that is actually the first year that Black or African Americans will be free, longer than they have been enslaved here in the US since they were taken from their homeland in 1619. Again, our country's history, unfortunately, is not as decent as we want to make it out to be, because its modern legacies are alive and well today. So this is why I also want to do an acknowledgement that I am a descendant of African people who were enslaved, who were taken from their homeland to work on stolen foreign land. But I really gain a lot of my tenacity and my perseverance, from my ancestors. So this again is a part of the social justice framework that I seek to center in my work. And this quote here that you see on the slide, it is from the amazing Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is the creator of the 1619 Project from the New York Times, which really does an amazing job of reshaping national memory. And this quote here also kind of serves as an anchor for my social justice work as well. All right, so I want to go ahead and more formally begin my talk. So we are entering we have entered a very different realm in education, a very arduous era, an era that causes us to address our personal and institutional trauma, one that really causes us or calls for us to heal, right? And to truly realize the promises of higher ed. And to that end, those who are really invested in open education, open educational resources, have certainly had to do and grapple with some of the same issues because, of course, open ed doesn't operate in some sort of vacuum. And speaking of open ed and open educational resources, I know some of you all might be asking, what the heck is open education? So I do want to provide a little bit of context here. And I'm noticing that my image on the top right hand kind of cut off a little bit. So sorry about that. But open education is basically broadly this philosophy and practice that strives to realize education ecosystems that are accessible, affordable, equitable, and inclusive to everyone, regardless of their background. And so I think the most common way that faculty and students hear about open education, or at least participate in it, is through the creation of or adoption of open educational resources, which OERs for short. So OERs are basically materials for teaching or learning that are either in the public domain or have been released under some type of open license that allows them to be freely used, shared, and changed, with others. So they are typically free to the user, but not free to create. I think that's really important to stress here. Also, one of the aspects or characteristics about open educational resources that's very different from other free resources is that it's not just free to the user, right? It's the permissions piece that lets the user know what they can actually do with that content. And so we have here what are called the 5 R's of OER. So you can, with most OERs, keep it for as long as you want. You can remix it with another open educational resource so that it, might be more relevant to your students' learning conditions. You can revise it or edit it. You can redistribute it back out. And again, you can reuse it and adapt it accordingly. So again, I really want to stress that part of OER and not just the fact that these resources are free to the user. And my top, right-hand image kind of does a good job of expressing or communicating, some of the differences between commercial textbooks, library resources, and open educational resources. Although, for example, library resources are free to the students and to faculty, libraries have to pay a lot of money in order to make sure that's free to us. And not only that, what we can do with that content is still very restrictive, right? Because of the copyright aspect to it. With open educational resources, it's usually licensed under some type of open license that enables a lot of different things that we can use or we can do in the classroom. And then one other thing that I want to touch on in reference to OER before I go into the next kind of part of my talk is that OERs, at least research has proven that OERs do help students academically. So we find that either there's no change in terms of academic performance, those who use OERs, students who use OERs compared to those students who do not, or there's a slight positive change, or there's a positive impact on those students who are using OERs in the classroom compared to those who don't. So I cite this study a lot, and this study was produced out of the University of Georgia about 2 or 3 years ago or so. And they looked at large classes at their institution, I think math, biology, sociology, and I forget the other class off the top of my head. And they wanted to see whether or not there was a impact on students, academic impact on students who use OER compared to those students who were enrolled in classes that did not use OER. And they found that actually those students who used OER, their grades actually improved. And this was particularly prominent among Pell eligible grant students. So those are those students that unfortunately might slip through the cracks, or they have nuanced issues that they're dealing with that perhaps non-Pell eligible students are not dealing with. We also found, or they also found, that students who use OERs actually had lower DFW rates. So that's grades of D, F, or withdrawal rates. And again, this particular finding was specifically profound among Pell eligible grant students. And so again, all in all, what we're finding, the research is finding that OERs do put students at an academic advantage, and that it helps us to keep our students here as well. So I have really been invested in this issue of open education and OERs for quite some time now. I think for the past 5 years or so, not just 5 years. And so what I'm specifically interested in is how can open education be used as a social justice tool in order to address some of these issues that I'm going to go into in a more nuanced way, issues within higher ed. And some of those issues are kind of captured in the questions that I have here that will guide my talk. And so the first question is, how does a socially just open ed look during a nationwide racial awakening and a global pandemic? So we're dealing with a lot of issues here around the world, but especially here in the US. My second question is, what are some commitments and promises that open ed needs to revisit? And I think we can broaden this up to higher ed. What are some promises and commitments that we need to revisit or revamp even? And then my third question is, what now takes priority in open education? And again, I think we can swap out the word open education for higher ed as well. So like I said at the beginning of my talk, I don't promise you that I have all the answers to those questions. It's something that I am, continuously thinking about, and I know the answers will ultimately change as our needs or as our students' needs, and our faculty needs also change as time progresses. So what I want to do here is begin by talking about, of course, the elephant in the room. And that is, and I don't think it's the elephant in the room, it's very prominent. And that is how COVID, of course, has fundamentally changed, how we imagine education and our role in this system. It has, unfortunately revealed and even exacerbated inequities that we should have addressed a lot more intentionally before COVID was even a thing. And so we also need to pay attention to how there is so much isolation and anxiety and depression going on within and outside of higher ed, within and outside of community colleges, even more now than what we were seeing pre-COVID. And so as a kind of side note, it also, something that I'm thinking about a lot is, it shouldn't take a global pandemic for people to sympathize with the modern legacies of, for example, systemic racism, or to see our faculty, students, and staff as human. But unfortunately, it seems like it took a global pandemic in order for that to happen. So when we are talking about open education and what it means to revisit some of those global commitments that open ed has made, especially during the COVID-19 era, I think it means, and this might be a little of a tangent, but I think it's relevant. It means approaching things from a mental health standpoint, okay? And so what does this look like? If you're coming from an educator standpoint, which I am, I think this means teaching with mental health in mind. And this is something that we can, of course, do post-COVID, whatever that means, right? I know there are states that are lifting restrictions here. Here in my state of Ohio, our governor announced that restrictions are going to be completely lifted come June 2nd. So what does this world look like post-COVID? And I think this moment that we're living in right now is, it provides us with a great opportunity for us to create a culture of wellness with students that can lead to pathways for academic success, instead of assuming that, for example, we know what's best for them. And this, of course, includes teaching with empathy and mental health in mind. And I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about OERs is that they can potentially address, by its nature, this issue of mental health. And what I mean by that is that some or most, not all, are designed with cost savings and accessibility in mind. I always wondered what we were doing to students when, for example, we assigned a textbook that was $75 to $150, or even more than that, depending upon the field that you're in. What we're doing to them psychologically, right? Or when we assign materials that do not reflect their heritage, do not reflect their culture's way of knowing or producing knowledge, right? What kind of messages, and as a result, what type of mental health implications are we creating in terms of sending messages to students who cannot afford the course materials, right? And so I'm wondering if we're sending the message to those students that they don't belong in the classroom. And when we're thinking about inclusive education and centering or prioritizing a certain culture's experience, I do wonder what kind of messages we're sending to students who are not of that cultural background, that their knowledge is not reliable or valued in higher ed. And so these are just, again, some of the things that I'm kind of thinking about as well. And so, we have to really center this human approach. That's what I'm getting at in academia. Our students are yearning for human connection, probably now more than ever. And, just like faculty are, right? And so I encourage those, especially those who are teaching, who are, in the trenches, for lack of better words, to lead and teach with empathy. Yes, we have to get through the content in our classes, and we have to manage our own wellness while trying to be aware of our students' wellness. I completely understand. Trust me, I do. I just finished my spring semester and it was intense. But I've been saying this for the past year now, ever since honestly the pandemic started, because it's something that I realize, and that is that we are teaching students, right, and not content. And I think that'll help us in balancing this desire that we have with centering our students' wellness, while centering wellness in general in our classroom. And so that's what I mean by we're teaching students, not content. And students will remember that more about your classroom than who you are as a professor, than the content that you cover, right? So again, it's my argument that students remember that more about your class as opposed to, the actual content. We have to keep in mind that students are not, just these knowledge buckets where we dump all of this content into, and at the end of the day, they're people just like us. And so my argument is that the content will come, it really will, in some capacity, right? But we have to prioritize radical empathy for students and faculty. That cannot, nor should it wait. And so this human approach that is centered on wellness and healing that I think is so needed in the academy is actually very personal for me. It is a social justice act. And the reason why I say that is because I am relentlessly intentional about humanizing my scholarship and just who I am as a person in academia. Because for me, again, like I said, it's an act of resistance. And the reason why it's an act of resistance is because we still live in a society that is determined to dehumanize women and people of color. And this dehumanization, unfortunately, is nothing new. If we look at the shameful history of dehumanization of people of color in the West and how it was used to justify the creation of oppressive measures and systems. And speaking of that, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but as a friendly reminder, because we're seeing a lot of, colleges, community colleges, universities, and liberal art, colleges really want to tackle this issue of like social justice, diversity, equity, inclusion, especially in light of what happened last summer to George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, right? I think for a lot of people, it was a huge shock. And for a lot of people of color, it was not. And this has made a lot of universities, colleges really think about these issues. And I do want us all to keep in mind that it is an act of oppression when you ask people who are oppressed to educate you about their oppressed experiences and you do nothing about it. So it's not necessarily just the education piece, even though there's a lot of emotional labor to that. It's when you're asking someone to share their trauma and you do nothing about it. That's an act of oppression. So the two are happening at the same time. Essentially, what you're doing when you're not taking some form of action, you're not handling their story with care, right? So if you take someone's humanity seriously, there will be some form of action behind it, whether it's something very small or something very consequential, like advocating for policy change. And speaking of action, right, that helps to get closer at a more socially just academe, last summer, again, I mentioned the murder of George Floyd and how that really had a ripple effect on our racial conscience here in the United States. I felt very compelled to write an article explaining what specifically white people can do to address white supremacy in academia, because this is not just the effort of people of color, right? And so in this article, which everyone can access, it's just on Medium, right? So it's not a peer-reviewed journal article or anything like that. In this article, what I try to do is provide, very practical tips, some that can be implemented immediately, while others might take, a little bit more time. And I'll make sure I'll include that link there in the chat a little bit later on. I mean, if someone else finds it, that's great as well. But I wrote this article because, honestly, during that time I was, and I hope this doesn't come across as condescending or anything like that. I was just so tired. I was so tired because just like everyone else, I was dealing with just the shock and the anxiety of COVID, right? COVID was still a very new thing. We were only 3 months into the pandemic, at least in the US. But on top of that, I had to deal with the racial trauma as a Black woman, seeing someone just murdered so brutally and that being captured on video and what that meant for me as a Black person in the United States. That was a lot. And so on top of that, I had a lot of my colleagues and friends saying, well, what can we do about racial justice and all of that? And it was just a lot. And so I still want to be helpful to people. And so what I did is I wrote this article in hopes that it would be helpful, right? Again, very practical tips and some things that'll take a little bit more longer to implement. And so what I also wanted to achieve in this article is I wanted people to notice how white supremacy actually informs a lot of the norms in academia. And again, because I know when people say the word white supremacy, it brings up a lot of feelings for people, right? And so I want to make sure that I'm clear when I say the word white supremacy. So using the work from Dr. Robin DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility, who I know her work has come under some scrutiny and critique, but I actually really like how she talks about white supremacy and white fragility. So she argues, and I do have a quote here in my notes. She argues that white supremacy, it does not refer to, quote, the individual white people or white person or their individual intentions or actions, but to an overarching political, economic, and social system of domination. She goes on to say that white supremacy is more than the idea that, for example, whites are superior to people of color. It is the deeper premise that supports this idea. The definition of whites as the norm or the standard for human, right? So I talked about humanity and human approach a lot during the first part of my talk, and positions people of color as a deviation from that norm or subhuman. So if we look at, for example, the work of, I believe their name is Judith Katz, and this article was published way back in the 90s, I think even the early 1990s. And it was a very short article called Aspects and Assumptions of White Culture in the US. We can see how this shows up in academia as well. So for example, the notion of rugged individualism, this idea of self-reliance, and how that can actually create a very isolating place in higher ed, even though at the same time we encourage collaboration. It's almost kind of like a contradiction there. If you look at what type of communication is prioritized or deemed as professional English or professional language, it's the King's English, right? So it really limits other vernaculars as also being professional, right? How are we operationalizing that term and that practice of professionalism? Another thing to consider, the competition, right? The competitive nature of academia, not only amongst faculty, but sometimes among students. This pressure to be the number one at all costs. And finally, if we look at some of the historical discourses that are centered in academia, it actually privileges the experiences of, for example, European immigrants and presents the genocide of indigenous people and the enslavement of Africans as more of an inconvenience as opposed to a gross injustice. So, what I'm talking about here is that we have to continuously work at dismantling whiteness, like the norms, the values behind that, as the main structure in academia, if we truly want a socially just higher ed. And speaking of, justice in higher ed, now I want to go into what this looks like in open ed, right? So let's go ahead and talk about that a little bit more directly. So I mentioned earlier how the spirit of open education really prides itself on advocating for inclusive, equitable, affordable, accessible education, which of course I think is incredible. I really feel like I found my community within higher ed. scholars who are really thinking critically about these issues. But like any movement or discipline that's trying to, address these issues, there are, I don't want to say blinders because I feel like that sounds ableist, but there are just things that we need to be more aware of. And the reason why, at least I believe that maybe we're not more aware of some of these issues is due to the privilege that we all have in some shape or form. So I'm not just talking about racial privilege, I'm talking about access privilege, educational privilege, right? Even nationality privilege. So using a social justice framework, as many scholars in open ed have called for us to do, will not only help us to address these privileges, but also work more productively towards our goal of actually advocating for a more inclusive education, which is extremely imperative during the COVID-19 period. So my first conversation about open ed was not framed as a social justice issue, but rather a textbook affordability issue, which of course, right, it does have some social justice elements to it when we're talking about access, economic justice, things of that sort. But now that I've been in open ed in the space for the past 5 years, I'm asking myself, was it a problem that my first conversation about open ed and my introduction to that was not framed as a social justice issue? Would I feel differently about the topic than I do now? And more importantly, when I created my own open textbook, would I have asked the right questions? Which then in turn, at least hopefully, would have made the content in my materials more inclusive and representative of marginalized communities. So it's really my belief that initial conversations about open ed and OERs to faculty, staff, students, administrators, it really should be discussed from this social justice angle. And so one way we can not only frame these conversations from a social justice angle, but at least approach it from the social justice angle in open ed in particular is by correcting our historical discourses in the field. And what I mean by that is acknowledging that, OERs I think are relatively new, but the idea behind open ed, the fact that, education should be affordable, accessible, all that good stuff, and interrogating the role of the professor and student in the classroom, those ideas that support the very premise of open ed they're not actually new, right? They really aren't. And so in fact, much of the spirit of open education comes from Indigenous communities and Black feminist thought. And there are other scholars who do an amazing job of asserting this and kind of laying down the framework and groundwork for this stuff. So last year at the 2020 Open Ed Conference, which was a really good conference to attend, Marco Seiferle Valencia, he's an open education librarian at the University of Idaho. He delivered a brilliant presentation called, I think it was OERs, oh gosh, now I'm blanking out. OERs as an intentionally engaged social justice, I think it was. I'm probably not saying it correctly. But in his presentation, he argued that, of course, when we're talking about open education OERs, we have to move beyond textbook, discourse, right? Or textbook replacement. That tends to kind of take up the conversation about OERs, open educational resources. But the most exciting part about his talk is that he actually connected open education ideologies and premises to Black feminist thought. And so he specifically argued that conventional histories, and scholarly contextualizations of open movements do not connect open pedagogy to liberatory women of color, feminist proxies, and scholarship on education. So that was a quote from his presentation. So in other words, what he's arguing here is that open ed is actually nothing new in terms of its ideologies. And like I said earlier, ideologies that get at interrogating the role of the classroom, interrogating institutional frameworks. How do we go about producing knowledge, policies, procedures, all of that, right? The idea of openness is rooted actually in Black feminist liberation. Yet those who are in open education or who are somewhat exposed to OERs kind of know that much of the credit in terms of defining open education and ways to think about this is actually given to white and or cisgender male scholars in open ed and even outside of open ed. Also it's mostly these, white men who are considered thought leaders in open education. And when we're talking about OERs, although I'm hopeful that we're in this interesting moment where that is beginning to change, where we're seeing other scholars being highlighted as well. And so I guess my question here, and I know we can't answer this today, but what is to be said about open education in OERs? The idea behind open education that supports OERs, what is to be said about open education when we can trace its practices and ideologies beyond current thought leaders? Now, again, it's certainly not to discount their labor, but rather, call attention to the ease we have in assigning authoritative knowledge to white men without considering the immense contributions of people of color from both the global North and global South. So much of what we know now as open education has been talked about in great detail and is beautifully demonstrated in the labor of scholars of color, particularly women of color. So this is one small but powerful way that we can center social justice in open education by correcting our historical narratives about this movement. So if we look at this quote, which is from Bell Hooks, she's a very famous Black feminist for those who are unaware of her work, from her book, Teaching to Transgress. She talks about, how the classroom should go beyond, its limits that have been imposed right on the classroom. And she really supports this notion of transgression, right? A movement against and beyond boundaries. And I embrace these situations that she speaks of. And so I believe that the classroom is actually a pretty dynamic place where radical transformation can happen. But anyways, so this ideology that's put forth by Bell Hooks is actually replicated in open education practices, such as open pedagogy. So for those who don't know what open pedagogy is, it's actually the practice of engaging with students as creators of information through OER and other open practices, rather than them just being simply consumers of information. So they're creators of knowledge and information. So all of this kind of leads to like what Bell Hooks, I think, is trying to say here in Teaching to Transgress, the transgressions of boundaries, right? So both open pedagogy and what Bell Hooks is saying here challenges the role of both students and faculty and educators. And it also helps us to center students' knowledge as valuable. So again, just to kind of wrap up this part of my talk, what I am arguing here is that these ideas that are, that influence OERs and open pedagogy and open education more broadly, they're really not completely new. And we need to acknowledge this instead of packaging open education in whiteness and white saviorhood. We have a plethora of scholars of color to thank for already doing and continuing to do this hard work. And so what are some other ways, we can put social justice into practice? Well, we have to make sure that we are actually striving to achieve multiple types of justice in open ed. And again, I'm seeing here that a little bit of the content has been taken off the top of my slide, so sorry about that. But what this table here is from Dr. Sarah Lambert, who is a scholar actually out of Australia. And a few years ago, she wrote an amazing paper that looks at the intersections between open ed and social justice. This paper is cited a lot for those who are interested in social justice and what that looks like in open ed, and honestly, what that looks like in general in higher ed. And so she's asking some really good questions in this paper. One of the questions that she's asking is, how much does open ed truly serve the underserved and underprivileged? And so in this paper, she conducts basically an analysis drawing from the work of, I believe, I can't remember the scholar's name off the top of my head. It's okay. But she creates these 3 social justice principles that can be applied to open education. And so I really like how Dr. Lambert is interrogating and challenging the definition of open, right? If we are charged to look at it from a social justice angle. And so in her paper, and I have a quote here, she says, how open is the textbook for marginalized learners if Indigenous, Hispanic, and learners of color are invisible inside the textbook and perhaps invisible in the whole curriculum? The editing of such a textbook to include images and cases featuring more diverse communities, businesses, and people will be an act of recognitive justice. But, and she goes on to say, what if the textbook features people of color, but does not value their perspectives, knowledges, or histories? What if the textbook takes a white colonial view of Black lives if Black stories are told solely by white voices? The development or selection of a new version of a textbook, or perhaps a new resource altogether, written by people of color, where they are free to represent their own views, histories, and knowledges, would be an act of representational justice. So again, we can see how in a lot of OER open education conversations, we tend to focus a great deal on redistributive justice, right? So access, things of that sort, which is important, but let's not stop there, right? So open ed can help us to achieve a variety of, or different types of justices, if you will. So, let's delve into the notion of how we can realize recognitive and representational justice by interrogating whose stories get to be told in OERs and just in general in our curriculum, and who gets the privilege of telling those stories, who gets the privilege of even creating this content, right? And bringing their lived experiences into the content in some capacity. So as I stated earlier in my talk, I'm really curious about the implications that come from decisions that professors make, and I include myself in that, in terms of their course material selection. So these implications really point to the issues, again, of who gets to have a voice and who does not. And I'm actually going to rephrase that. It's not that people don't get to have a voice, it's just whose voice is actually centered in our classroom, right? And so this can have such a profound impact on students. And I know because I was one of those students with this experience where I felt like people who looked like me or my way of knowing was not centered in the classroom, wasn't even touched on in the classroom, right? So focusing on recognitive and representational, justice, and also redistributive justice helps faculty and students to bring their lived experiences into the classroom, into the content, thus acknowledging, you're going to hear me say this term a lot, that their knowledge is valuable and reliable. So this can have a particularly powerful effect, again, on those who are coming from marginalized communities, where there is unfortunately a huge, in my opinion, devaluation of these lived experiences in our community. So I want to go ahead and, highlight some work from scholars of color in particular, who were trying to make their course materials more socially just, using open pedagogy or OERs in some capacity. So this example, and I'm not sure why my slides keep kind of like cutting off a little bit. Let me see if I can actually fix that. Does that look a little better? Hopefully. But Doctors Gloria Snively, I believe that's how you pronounce their last name, and Lorna Williams out of Canada created an open textbook that helps to bring Indigenous science into the fold with Western science. And I really love this because we constantly, I might get in trouble for saying this, we constantly assume that Western science is the safest or most reliable. Yet when we look at the healthcare experiences of people of color in the West, and again, the history of these healthcare experiences, that paints a very different story, but that's kind of a side note. Anyways, so as written by the authors of this textbook, I do have a quote here, and you all can actually see this towards the end in their synopsis of the textbook. So they say, when we braid Indigenous science with Western science, we acknowledge that both ways of knowing are legitimate forms of knowledge. This is socially just education, and open education at that. Another example I want to share is from Dr. Sherry Deckman. She is a professor from SUNY, of course, in New York. And she created an open pedagogy assignment in which her graduate students created final project websites. And she, in a webinar that I was watching where she talks about this, she said she did this because, she really thinks that Black girlhood studies is well aligned with open pedagogy ideology. So kind of like what I was talking about earlier, the fact that open pedagogy is drawing from actually Black feminist liberation, and we need to actually, acknowledge this. And so she states, and again, just want to read a quote from her, that Black girlhood studies is situated in a tradition that interrogates whose knowledge is reliable and critiquing things that have always just been done a certain way. Black girlhood studies questions the ways in which knowledge has been traditionally constructed and dominant epistemologies. So again, she had her graduate students create websites, and you can see an example of, on this slide here, from one of her students, Kristen Miller. And she did this because she wanted to make sure that this assignment was more accessible beyond the academy, right? Which could be a resource for all kinds of educators and just people in general. So she wants this assignment to be more open, for lack of better words. And her graduate student here, Kristen Miller, author of this website, or the image of the website that you see here, stated that it was actually initially challenging to do this type of like open pedagogy, more open work, but it encouraged her to think differently, right? And to bring her lived experience into the work and to reimagine, the utility of public scholarship and public facing education. So again, this is just another example of how we can use open pedagogy and OER as a social justice tool. Another example of how we've seen scholars of color organize and address the urgency of centering social justice is actually a group that I'm involved in, and that group is called Socially Just Academia. And you'll see here a screenshot of our launch event that happened last year. We do have another event coming up this summer as well. So Socially Just Academia is a group that, again, some of you might have heard of, but this is a group that actually stems from a project called Equity Unbound. And this is led by Drs. Mahabali, Mia Zamora, and Catherine Cronin. And the Socially Just Academia group came from a discussion that was held at an inclusive citation webinar last summer. And this was coming off of the heels of the racial injustice protests that started again here in the US and really rippled across the world. But this Socially Just Academia group is a group of scholars from across the world, not just the US, Canada, or the UK, mostly people of color, and that seek to engage in a more open network committed to dismantling oppression in education systems. And we also discuss practices that get a little closer at, anti-racist practices and, really decolonizing, the academy and dismantling oppression within our respective institutions. And we do talk about open education OERs, and sometimes we, like I said at the beginning of my talk, sometimes we are not talking about OERs or open ed because that might not be the tool to use in order to achieve socially just or social justice in that moment. So that's another resource or something to check out for those who are interested in that. Some other things that we can do to put this into action. Again, the examples I'm going to go through on this slide, some of them are drawing from OERs and open education, and some of them are not. And the one that I want to talk about that is not, it has nothing to do with OERs, is starting with your syllabus, right? How can you make your classroom more socially just? It can start with your syllabus. Be aware of the language that you're including, right? So even the way that we talk about the syllabus, and I have been guilty of doing this. It wasn't until very recently I thought, ooh, okay, that's probably not the best thing to say. And that is oftentimes we would tell students that the syllabus is a contract, right? But this is a contract that they had no say in whatsoever. And so I encourage you to maybe, think of co-creating your syllabus with your students. Leave a particular unit blank and ask your students, what do they want to learn, in this particular unit? have a theme in mind, obviously, but then have the students kind of guide the learning process. Going back to the whole language with contract, instead of saying it's a contract, it's a community agreement, right? That does actually have a tremendous impact on the ways in which your students approach your classroom and their feelings of autonomy and empowerment in your classroom as well. Helps to kind of minimize this power dynamic that we tend to create in academia between faculty and students. Another way that we can achieve a more socially just classroom in general, and this has nothing to do with OERs or open education, but has a lot to do with co-creation, is again, co-creating assignments with your students, co-creating policies with your students. This was something small, but I'm finding out was very impactful to my students that I did this past year since the pandemic started last March. And that is, I had my students create their own attendance policy. Day one, I said, or day two, technically, because I went through some of the course content and what have you. The second day of our class, I said, you know what, I actually don't have an attendance policy for this course. I want us to co-create that. And I told my colleagues this, and they were like, are you crazy? They're going to say, we can miss up to 15 classes. And actually, my students were not asking for that. They were very reasonable. And I think that was a lesson for me. And I told my colleagues this as well. We need to trust our students more. We need to have a little more faith in them, right? And I found that, students actually bought into the policy more, or into the classroom more, when they felt like they actually had a voice. They had a say in the policies and the assignments and what have you. They were a lot more engaged than I've seen them, even when we were in person, believe it or not. So again, this is just a minor way that we can get a little more at creating a more socially just classroom. For those who are interested in creating open educational resources, we have several, or an increasing amount of scholars who are doing this with their students. I meant to actually show this example, but I'm realizing now that I forgot to. But there are, again, a fair amount of open educational resources, particularly textbooks, that have been created not only by faculty, but students. So both faculty and students are creating the same resource here. There's one that I'm thinking of. There's a social media open textbook that was just published, that was created by a faculty, I think in Arizona, I can't remember off the top of my head. And her students helped her to also create this open textbook. And students love that. I've also done that in a different capacity and with my students. So I mentioned earlier that I do have an open textbook that I wrote some years ago, and I've been kind of updating it as I go. And one of the things that I'm doing now is, for extra credit, I will have students basically write a very brief application paper. So if I'm talking about, for example, journalistic practice, they apply it to some type of real world situation. And if it's, relevant enough to my open textbook, I ask the students whether or not they want to openly license that paper. And what I do there is put the synopsis, not the synopsis, put the description of their work in my open textbook. And when I tell that to students, when I ask them, hey, can your reflection paper, or would you mind if I include your reflection paper, your description of this class concept in the open textbook, their eyes just get really big, like, wait, you want me to contribute to this textbook that other students are going to learn from? And they actually end up really liking that, because again, it goes back to affirming that the ways in which they're thinking about these classic concepts is just as valuable as the way that I am thinking about these class concepts. A particular example that I am thinking of was a few years ago. We were having some discussion about social media and intersections between, I think it was beauty or body image or something like that. And one of my students gave a really great K-pop example, Korean pop example. And I asked her, hey, do you want to basically, write what you said in class for extra credit? And, if so, I'll include it in my open textbook. And she was just very excited to even have that opportunity, right? So again, that's just another way that we can, bring our students into this knowledge creation process. So again, what I'm talking about here is open pedagogy, but I will say that there are some scholars that, of course, encourage open pedagogy, but we have to do it in a just manner. So going back to Dr. Mahabali and some of her other colleagues stated in a relatively recent paper that we have to make sure that we are not just inviting students from dominant epistemologies into the process, because that's just basically reproducing, unjust ways of knowing or unjust ways of producing a knowledge. We often also have to make sure that we're not exploiting student labor. So we're not saying that you have to openly license this extra credit paper, right? Students should have autonomy to say, yes, I want this to be public work, or I want this to be public facing, or no, actually, I do not want it to be public facing. Another way that we can incorporate social justice elements into our classroom has nothing to do with open ed actually at all, is to do something that I actually got from my university. We had an assessment conference not too long ago, and that is to do or to show a scholar each week, a scholar who comes from one of the many different backgrounds of your students. So highlighting scholars of color in your field, highlighting women, highlighting trans folks, highlighting, again, those who are specifically from marginalized communities, because that is so profoundly effective and impactful to students, right? And then finally, for those who, again, are doing open work publishing and open access journals, doing OER, creating it, even doing open pedagogy projects with your students, that should be counted towards tenure and promotion, right? We need to make sure that we are valuing this work by rewarding students and faculty, especially who are doing this hard work, right? So I'm approaching the end of my talk. So for the past hour or so, I talked a great deal about the promises of open ed and how it can be used as a social justice tool. And I went through several examples of open pedagogy projects and more inclusive OERs that I really like. And so although I'm advocating for anti-racist or for anti-racism and social justice to be at the core of OER, I want to make sure that we're doing this with care, right? We have to be intentional about how we're doing this, and we have to have an awareness of whether open is culturally appropriate. So referring back to the 2020 Open Ed Conference, one of the amazing keynotes there was Jessie Lawyer. She's a librarian in, Mount Royal University in Canada. And she delivered such a thought-provoking keynote and argued the push towards openness sometimes means that we might miss some cultural context and that there are some things that should not be open. So for example, Jessie says that, if we're looking at open access and the idea behind open access, and if we look at Indigenous thought and assertions about information, both can kind of come from the same impulse. And that impulse is the idea that something is being held from us, right? So she's arguing that both open access and Indigenous thoughts about access to information can come from the same idea or same premise. But she also goes on to argue that there are important differences to consider. So she says she argues that open access positions itself as arguing that open is unlimited, right, to everyone. Indigenous thought about access to information argues that open is for those who are the rightful authors and inheritance of this information. So Jessie goes on to assert that we need, for example, Indigenous consultation when we're referring to open access and open education in general, if we truly want to use open ed as a tool to serve Indigenous sovereignty and let Indigenous people decide what happens to their information. So I'm wondering, in what ways can we apply this same cultural competence, in terms of like advocating for open to other marginalized communities when we're trying to leverage open or open education in the name of engaging in socially just labor and equity. So yeah, just applying this cultural competence in the name of open. And then, we also have to consider the differing risk of doing such work in open education. And what I mean by that, it depends upon who is doing this labor. So particularly scholars of color who are, often charged to do anti-racism work with students or study social justice issues, unfortunately, they are at a particular risk. And so there's an increasing amount of faculty of color who, again, unfortunately, are aggressively attacked for simply doing their work, calling out, the very systems that breed inequity and discrimination. And I'm thinking of an article by Dr. Stephen Finley, Biko Gray, and Lori Martin. This article is titled Affirming Our Values, and it discusses the particular vulnerability that faculty of color face in doing their work, especially if they're writing or researching, race-related issues or talking about such topics in the classroom. There's actually an increasing amount of faculty of color who are, and those authors talk about that in the article, who are the victims of what they're calling like virtual mobs. Oh yes, I put it there in my slides. Some of them are, the victims of violent threats being sent to them via email. This was pre-COVID, obviously, mentioned that someone had followed them to their child's school because of an interview they did on MSNBC and sharing their scholarship about race. It was just really, really crazy. And then also in doing this socially just work or social justice labor, there are other risks, right? And I can attest to this. In terms of this past year and a half, I have really revamped a lot of my assignments and course materials to actually get closer at a more socially just classroom. But, not all students, I don't want to say like that, but not all students are coming from the same vantage point that I am or are prioritizing social justice. I've been accused of, liberal brainwashing or, trying to push forth a liberal agenda. And I always find that funny when people are doing social justice work and centering it, when people are talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and actually centering that in their classroom and their research, that tends to be the response, liberal brainwashing, liberal agenda, things of that sort. And the reason why I find it interesting is because, politics is at the core of almost every educational practice and decision that's made within and outside of the classroom. It's just a matter of whose politics are centered, right? And so there has to be more institutional support and infrastructure around protecting scholars who are trying to do this hard work. It is hard. And again, this is already a particularly vulnerable population, and to not protect them while they're doing this important scholarship and this important pedagogy, in my opinion, is an act of disrespect and devaluing this work and truly gross negligence. So let's keep this in mind when we deliver an ask of certain groups. All right, so I am finally at the end of my talk here, so we do have enough time for Q&A, but I just want to wrap up by saying a few things that our commitment, of course, in education is so important during this time. And we can't buy into the idea that engaging in social justice labor in higher ed has to wait until a more appropriate time. This is the time. Right? So the historically marginalized are even more at the margins during the pandemic because of systemic discrimination and oppression. We really have to remain steadfast in creating more socially just policies, traditions, and procedures in higher ed because of these issues and problems. And, like I mentioned, just 2 seconds ago, I understand this work is extremely challenging and emotionally exhausting and intellectually exhausting at times, but I am reminded of a webinar I watched a few months ago. Dr. Angela Davis, Patrice Cullors, who's one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, and Michelle Alexander, of course, I'm going to mention in just a second. They were talking about just social justice and what that means right now. And someone from the audience asked Michelle Alexander, who I didn't contextualize her. She's the author of The New Jim Crow. Some of you might have read the book or at least heard of it. She's a scholar out of Stanford University. And someone asked her, basically, when are we going to reach a moment where social justice is no longer needed, right? Are we actually going to see the harvest of social justice? And her response was just so amazing, because I sometimes get those questions from people as well. Like, when can I check off everything on my DEI social justice classroom list? When can I be done? When do I know that my classroom is the most socially just that I can be? And so, drawing from this quote from Michelle Alexander, she said, I never really quite understand those type of questions, because for me, social justice is a process, not a destination. And I just love, love, love how she stated that affirmed me in so many ways. Social justice is something that we are always going to be doing in some capacity. And so this is a career-long, lifelong commitment, right? That we need to make, and that we need to center in our scholarship, in our classroom. And so I believe that, an open education or higher education, that it has to be firmly rooted in social justice commitments in order to truly, truly, truly be transformative. And so that is all that I have for you. Thank you so very much. And I think now we can go ahead and there's my contact information and what have you. I do actually answer my emails. I know there are some keynotes that give out their email address and then you follow up with them and then they don't answer. So if you do have questions that maybe you don't feel comfortable posing here, you want to follow up with me via email, you want to chat, there's my email address. For those who are on Twitter, there's my Twitter handle. You can also follow me, and I do follow people back. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I think that's a good place to stop.
Jasmine, thank you so much. When you get a chance, I recommend that you take a look at the chat. You have clearly made a real profound impact on those of us here in the audience, especially when you said that the work can be isolating, it can be depressing, it can be frustrating.
Very much so.
Yeah, I think many, if not all of us, can relate to that. And I appreciate the wide range of knowledge that you've given us during this 1 hour presentation, from the basics of open licensing materials with your discussion of Creative Commons, all the way to your deep dive issues of mental health and social justice and open education. So very much appreciated. There are some questions for you. So what I'll do is I'll say it out loud, and then I just want to make sure that I don't miss any other questions from the bottom. So we have a question here from Emily Rosado, who, and the question is, how do you suggest faculty protect themselves from compassion fatigue due to the emotional labor of tackling tough issues with our students, especially faculty of color?
Yes. In a nutshell, what I'm going to say and I'm going to explain is that I don't know if I have a good answer to that question, because I am still trying to figure that out myself. And to that person's point, it is particularly pronounced, not to say that, other scholars aren't dealing with compassion fatigue, but it is compounded for scholars of color, also particularly compounded for women of color scholars. It really goes on. What I have tried to do that has helped a little bit is to be extremely transparent with my students. And again, I know this works for some people and others, they're not as comfortable. I will tell my students that, for example, I'm worried about them, or I understand. So for example, at Ohio State, we didn't have a spring break. We had instructional breaks that were basically 2 days. And to be honest with you, they were not helpful. And, we felt very, very burnt out. And just telling my students just how that makes me feel emotionally, I think that helps them to connect in that way. And it helps me with my compassion fatigue, because my students in a way affirm how I am feeling in those moments, right? They act as my champion, right? When I'm presenting myself as human. I think it's something that I feel more comfortable talking to my department head about. I'm not sure what at Montgomery College, if you all, your faculty, do like evaluations at the end of the academic year, but it's something I've talked about a great deal in the past couple of years, writing down compassion fatigue and how that has affected my scholarship, how that has affected my pedagogy, how that should be taken into consideration, right, when we're talking about the faculty experience. So the most practical thing, just to wrap that up, what I've done is humanize myself in front of my students, because them acknowledging that I am even going through this compassion fatigue helps so much, that they even just notice that that's a thing that's going on. And talking to my department head about it, which is, I don't want to say more difficult, but it unfortunately has to come from a very scholarly standpoint, I found, in order for administrators to understand that. In my experience, I'll say that. So I don't think that quite answers that person's question, because like I said, I'm still grappling with that. And I firmly believe that institutions need to consider that, right? Invest in resources and programs that address this compassion fatigue, the emotional labor that so many of us are going through, right? Address it from a systemic level. So yeah.
I think that addresses it just fine. In fact, I think what you're saying about humanizing yourself in front of your students is really related to the whole idea of open pedagogy, because with open pedagogy, what you're doing is lowering this traditional barrier that has been in place for so long, and it's hierarchical, and it only impedes on progress, I think. So
yeah, I believe that too.
Here is another question for you from Sean Fay. And his question is this. You mentioned the issue of OER work being accepted and reviewed as part of the tenure process. Has your research on OER found any changes in the publication requirements for many of the larger state and private universities and colleges to include OER materials and textbooks? It would be nice to see this content development be given a higher degree of importance in the academic in comparison to peer-reviewed journal editing, publication, and publisher textbook and books. So he's wondering if OER is beginning to gain steam in this area on the national level. He would love to see academic minds across the country contribute to this.
If that person can DM me their email address, there is a study that recently came out, I think, last August, that was looking at this, but the name fails me, but I can go ahead and email that to them. Looking at OER and PNT and all of that. To answer their question, I think it is I know it is gaining more awareness, especially among administrators, because faculty, not surprisingly, I shouldn't say that. Faculty do want to do this work. Some faculty do. And we have to interrogate the reward systems in academia that prevent faculty who really want to do this work from doing it, right? I'm thinking of Oregon State University and the University of Oregon, who they have, included OER and open work into their tenure and promotion. This is very, very popular among universities in Canada, in particular colleges and universities in Canada. I'm thinking of British Columbia University. I think there's a huge, I'm trying to think of the actual name of the initiative, but doing open work is necessary for all of their scholars to get tenure, right? And again, it didn't happen overnight, right? So there was a lot of organizing. Unions were involved in this process, right? And a lot of just proving the case for how open work is just as scholarly as traditional ways of doing scholarship. And for me, I guess I don't understand this notion. So we have to interrogate what how something is peer reviewed. And what I mean by that is, like, what do we mean by peer reviewed? Who are the peers that are reviewing? If that makes any sense. If we're looking at the editorial board of a peer reviewed journal, And the editorial board is not diverse, not only in terms of racial identity, gender identity, but in terms of like neurodiversity, right? Is that really a comprehensive and equitable peer review process? I don't know if I'm making sense there, but looking at that, and I love what this person is, I think, getting at, and that is like really interrogating impact. We say that a lot in academia: impact value, impact value. The ways in which we operationalize impact value in terms of like journal citations, that's very narrow, as opposed to public facing scholarship that is a very impactful, right? In terms of like people being able to access your research or your articles and things of that sort. Isn't that the very mission of public universities and colleges, community colleges, right? So to answer that question more directly, I don't know of a particular study off the top of my head, like the name of it, but I will definitely get back to that person. And yes, I think administrators are becoming more aware and trying to think of how can we include this work into tenure and promotion. And at the same time, I think there is a large enough majority that is still very resistant to the idea of including open work in tenure and promotion, because we are holding so hard onto this tradition of how we produce scholarship, which does come from a very white Western way of, producing knowledge and scholarship and what have you. So.
Thank you, Jasmine. So Sean, if you don't mind emailing Jasmine, I'm sure she can provide you with additional.
Yes, please do. Yeah.
Great, thank you. There's just one more question, Jasmine, if you don't mind.
No, not at all.
Well, you had talked about open education being more than just the affordability of the courses, right? Getting rid of those.
Yeah.
And I appreciate your talking us through those 3 social justice principles. And so the question is, how do we get our students to see open education from the same social justice lens?
What I've tried to do with my students is, that's kind of a difficult question for me to answer because I'm also currently thinking about this. What I have tried to do with my students, and I don't know if I necessarily mentioned open education, but just a very practical example. So I teach a lot of journalism and PR classes, and I teach them what is the traditional way of reporting and engaging in journalistic practices. And then I have them interrogate those practices as well. So if we're talking about the notion of here in the US, journalism is supposed to be objective and impartial, where do you think those ideologies come from, right? Is this article about, for example, Black Lives Matter truly impartial when most of the most of the sources are coming from police accounts and narratives? Is that impartial? No, right? And so then I navigate them to show them that that is an act of justice, what you just did, right? Interrogating these processes and traditions and policies and what have you. In terms of how we can do that, like showing that open ed is more than just a textbook affordability issue, I think inviting them into that content creation process is probably the most dynamic way of doing that. So, and it's a little scary for students, I'm not gonna lie, initially when you want them to co-create content with them, because for so long they have been socialized to think that, they're just knowledge buckets. They're just there just to, process information and that's it. And so when I present my open textbook as not just something I wrote, and that it is something that some of my students in the past have contributed to, and how this is not just a free resource. This is also something that I want you all to contribute to as well. And that is an act of justice, because what we're doing here is creating community knowledge or communal knowledge, and affirming that your lived experiences and the ways that you're thinking about this is just as valuable as mine. I think that's also a very practical way of showing that open ed and OER is not just a free textbook, it's participation in that knowledge creation as well. It's having students go out and find examples that they can relate to, and presenting those examples to their peers so that it kind of has this ripple effect as well.
And what a great skill that they can develop and foster for the labor market that we wouldn't necessarily find in
Right?
traditional pedagogy, right?
No. I mean, there's so many skills, right? There's obviously critical analysis, but again, I want my students to interrogate everything in the classroom, interrogate even my practices, right? And I think that's really helpful for them as they, go about their careers and what have you.
Exactly. Well, Jasmine,
Mhm.
that wraps up our session today. And thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to be with you
Absolutely.
again. Thank you to everyone for joining us as well. I will now turn this over to our Professional Development Director, Dr. Paul Miller.
Thank you, Shinta. And Jasmine, thank you so much for bringing this to the college this morning. As you referenced in your talk, this past year has been a challenge for everybody. And, conversations like this remind us of what we do and why we do it, and the students that we serve. And I really love the quote that you included from Michelle Alexander: social justice is a process, not a destination. And it's really a process that we are committed to at Montgomery College. And to some of the questions in the chat box, we will continue the conversation, we will continue this work, and we will continue this commitment to social justice as an institution and moving forward. And yeah, I just wanted to remind people about the rest of the week for the Professional Week Speaker Series. This afternoon, we are going to hear from students as we continue this theme of surviving to thriving over the course of this previous year. We'll be talking to student vaccine ambassadors and what they've done to educate not only the college community, but Montgomery County in regards to the vaccines and why the vaccines are so important to get us back into a new normal. Tomorrow, we'll be talking about teaming up against burnout and how teams and collaboration really hold the power to support faculty fatigue and the burnout that has, kind of hit us all in some way, shape, or form over the past year. Tomorrow afternoon, we'll be looking at the top 10 tips to avoid burnout. And then we'll wrap up on Thursday with a student panel with Dr. Pollard, where students will be sharing their journey of the past year, how they've adapted as students throughout the pandemic, and what they hope for Montgomery College in moving forward, but not only themselves, but future students. So again, thank you, everybody. Jasmine, again, thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you this afternoon.